The city's underbelly pulsed with a frenetic energy, a symphony of sirens and the staccato rhythm of hurried footsteps. Officer Jack Stratton, a veteran of the city's tumultuous streets, felt the familiar surge of adrenaline as he pursued his quarry. Tonight's target was a shadow, a fleeting figure darting through the labyrinthine alleys, a suspected accomplice in a recent string of armed robberies that had rattled the precinct. Jack's boots pounded the cracked asphalt, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The city's neon glow painted the scene in lurid hues, casting long, distorted shadows that danced with the flickering streetlights. He was a predator honed by years on the force, his senses sharpened, his instincts screaming that this was the one who would lead him to the heart of the operation. The suspect, a young black man named Jamal, weaved through the maze of backstreets with an agility that belied his lanky frame. He was a phantom, a whisper in the night, his heart pounding a frantic tattoo against his ribs. He didn't know why he was running, only that he had to. The fear that had gripped him when he saw the flashing blue lights in his rearview mirror wouldn't release him. Jack's grip tightened on his service weapon. He could feel the weight of it, the cold steel a reassuring presence in the chaos. He wasn't a racist, he told himself. He was a cop and his job was to protect and serve. But deep down, a nagging voice whispered that he was tired of these inner-city streets, tired of the constant tension, tired of the way these guys always seemed to be involved in something. Jamal's lungs burned. His legs screamed in protest, but he refused to yield. He wasn't a criminal. He was a student, a son, a brother. He was just trying to get home. But the flashing lights, the blaring sirens, they had turned his world into a nightmare. The chase led them into a dead-end alley, a cul-de-sac of brick and shadows. Jamal's escape route was cut off. He was trapped, cornered like a rat. Jack approached, his footsteps echoing in the silence. "Stop right there." Jack's voice boomed, amplified by the alley's acoustics. "Hands where I can see them." Jamal's hands trembled as he raised them, his eyes wide with fear. He was no match for this man, this officer, this symbol of authority. "I didn't do anything," Jamal pleaded, his voice barely a whisper. "Turn around, slowly," Jack commanded, his eyes scanning Jamal's form for any sign of a weapon. Jamal obeyed, his movements deliberate. Jack's eyes narrowed as he took in Jamal's appearance. The kid was young, maybe early 20s, dressed in a hoodie and jeans. He didn't look like a hardened criminal, but looks could be deceiving. "You fit the description of a suspect involved in a recent robbery," Jack said, his voice hard. "Now, put your hands behind your back." Jamal's heart pounded in his chest. He knew this was wrong. He hadn't done anything. But he also knew that arguing would only make things worse. As Jack moved to cuff him, Jamal flinched, a reflex born of fear. Jack interpreted the movement as resistance. He grabbed Jamal's arm, twisting it behind his back. Jamal cried out in pain. "I said stop resisting." Jack growled, his grip tightening. The two struggled, a brief, violent dance in the alley's shadows. Jamal, desperate, tried to break free. Jack, fueled by adrenaline and a growing sense of frustration, shoved Jamal against the brick wall. Jamal's head slammed against the rough surface, a sharp, searing pain exploding behind his eyes. He crumpled to the ground, his body racked with pain. Jack, his breath coming in ragged gasps, stood over Jamal, his eyes blazing. He had crossed a line, he knew, but he couldn't bring himself to care. He cuffed Jamal's wrists, the cold metal a stark contrast to the heat of his anger. He pulled Jamal to his feet, the young man's body limp and unresisting. As Jack led Jamal out of the alley, a sense of unease settled over him. He had been rough, too rough. But the kid had resisted, hadn't he? It was self-defense, wasn't it? Back at the precinct, Jamal sat in an interrogation room, his head throbbing, his wrists raw from the cuffs. He was scared, confused, and angry. He didn't understand why this was happening. Jack watched him through the one-way mirror, a knot of guilt tightening in his stomach. He knew he had overreacted, but he also knew that if he admitted it, it would be a black mark on his record, a stain on his reputation. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that he had made a mistake. But he pushed the thought aside, telling himself that he had followed procedure, that he had done his job. As the night wore on, the precinct buzzed with activity. Other officers came and went, their faces etched with the weariness of a long shift. But Jack couldn't shake the image of Jamal's face, the fear and confusion in his eyes. He replayed the arrest in his mind, searching for a justification, a reason to absolve himself of guilt. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he had let his prejudices cloud his judgment. He had seen a young black man, and he had made assumptions, jumped to conclusions. He had treated Jamal differently because of the color of his skin. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He wasn't a racist, he told himself, but his actions spoke louder than his words. As the first rays of dawn crept through the precinct windows, Jack made a decision. He would talk to the chief. He would tell him what had happened. He would face the consequences. He stood up, his legs heavy, his mind reeling. He had a lot to answer for. The question that lingered, heavy and unanswered, was, could he make this right? The tension in the precinct was palpable, a thick, suffocating blanket of unease. Jack Stratton stood outside the chief's office, his knuckles white, as he clenched his hands together. He knew this was at the moment of truth, the point of no return. The door swung open and Chief Thompson emerged, his face a mask of controlled fury. Stratton, my office now. The chief's voice was low, a dangerous rumble that sent a shiver down Jack's spine. Inside the office, the air crackled with unspoken accusations. The chief's eyes bore into Jack's, a silent interrogation that stripped away any pretense of innocence. Explain yourself, Officer Stratton. The chief's voice was sharp, a honed blade ready to dissect Jack's every word. Jack began his explanation, his voice strained, his words carefully chosen. He recounted the events of the previous night, the chase, the arrest, the altercation in the alley. He tried to paint a picture of justified action, a necessary use of force in the face of resistance. But the chief wasn't buying it. His eyes narrowed, his lips pressed into a thin line. He had seen the bruises on Jamal's face, the fear still lingering in his eyes. He had heard the whispers from the other officers, the murmurs of excessive force. You roughed him up, Stratton. The chief stated, his voice flat and cold. You went too far. Jack tried to defend himself. He cited his years on the force, his unblemished record. He argued that Jamal had resisted, that he had posed a threat. He was scared, Chief. Jack said, his voice rising. He was running, he wouldn't stop. Scared, the chief scoffed. Or maybe he was just a young black man in the wrong place at the wrong time, a young black man who fit a description. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Jack flinched. He knew what the chief was suggesting, but he refused to admit it even to himself. I followed procedure, Chief. Jack insisted, his voice tight. I did my job. Your job? The chief echoed, his voice laced with sarcasm. Your job is to protect and serve, not to rough up suspects based on their skin color. The chief stood up, his imposing figure looming over Jack. He walked to the window, gazing out at the city skyline, a tapestry of lights and shadows. You know, Stratton, I've seen a lot in my years on the force. The chief said, his voice low and thoughtful. I've seen good cops go bad, I've seen prejudice poison the best of us, but I always held out hope that things were changing, that we were making progress. He turned back to Jack, his eyes filled with a weariness that went beyond the long hours and the endless paperwork. I was wrong, he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. I was wrong to think that we could erase the stains of the past with a few training sessions and a diversity quota. The chief walked back to his desk and sat down. He picked up a file and opened it, his eyes scanning the contents. Jamal Thompson, he said, his voice flat. That's the young man you arrested last night. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He knew that name. He had seen it on the arrest report, but he hadn't made the connection. Thompson, Jack repeated, his voice a mere whisper. My son, the chief said, his voice devoid of emotion. That's my son you arrested last night. The room fell silent, the air thick with unspoken recriminations. Jack's world tilted on its axis. He had arrested the chief's son. The chief closed the file and looked at Jack, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and disappointment. You know, Stratton, I've always tried to give my officers the benefit of the doubt. The chief said, his voice low and dangerous. I've always believed that everyone deserves a second chance, but this is beyond the pale. He stood up and walked around his desk, his eyes never leaving Jack's. You're suspended, Stratton, he said, his voice cold and hard. Effective immediately. Turn in your badge and your weapon. Jack stood there, his world crumbling around him. He had crossed a line he could never uncross. Just then a knock came at the door and a young officer entered holding a tablet. Chief, we just got some video from the patrol car's dash cam. The chief took the tablet, his expression unreadable. He tapped the screen and the video began to play. The footage showed Jamal running, not from a crime scene, but from a group of white youths who were clearly harassing him. The video also showed the moment Jack tackled Jamal, the excessive force he used, and Jamal's cries of pain. The chief's face darkened as he watched the video. He handed the tablet to Jack. Watch this, Officer Stratton. Watch what you did. Jack's hands trembled as he took the tablet. He watched the video, his stomach churning, his face flushed with shame. The footage was undeniable proof of his wrongdoing. He had not only used excessive force, but he had also arrested an innocent man. The chief spoke, his voice heavy with disappointment. Well, Officer Stratton, what do you have to say for yourself? Jack's voice was barely a whisper. I have no excuse, Chief. I was wrong. The chief nodded slowly. Yes, you were. And now you will face the consequences. The room remained still, the silence broken only by the hum of the air conditioning. Jack's career, his reputation, everything he had worked for, was now hanging by a thread. The truth was out, and it was devastating. The weight of his actions pressed down on Jack like a physical burden, a crushing weight that threatened to suffocate him. He walked the streets not in the crisp uniform of an officer, but in the muted tones of a civilian, his badge, his gun, his sense of purpose, all stripped away, leaving him bare, exposed to the consequences of his prejudice. The suspension was indefinite, a chilling word that echoed the uncertainty of his future. He spent his days in a haze of regret, replaying the events of the night over and over again, each replay a fresh wave of shame. He saw Jamal's face, the fear, the pain, the injustice, and he knew he had to do something. He started small, volunteering at a local community center, a place where he could interact with the people he had so wrongly judged. He listened to their stories, their struggles, their hopes and dreams. He heard the echoes of his own biases in their experiences, the subtle and not so subtle ways that prejudice shaped their lives. He sought out resources, reading books and articles, attending workshops, anything he could find to educate himself about racial bias and systemic racism. He learned about the history of oppression, the legacy of slavery, the ongoing fight for equality. He began to understand the depth of the wounds he had inflicted. One day he found himself drawn to a small bookstore, a haven of words and ideas. He browsed the shelves, his fingers tracing the spines of countless volumes. He stumbled upon a book, a collection of essays about race and justice. He bought it and devoured it, its words resonating with his own awakening. He knew he had to apologize to Jamal, to Chief Thompson, to the community he had failed. He wrote letters pouring out his remorse, his understanding, his commitment to change. He didn't expect forgiveness, but he needed to express the depth of his regret. He requested a meeting with Chief Thompson, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. He sat in the same office where he had been suspended, the air thick with unspoken words. "Chief Thompson, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," Jack began, his voice trembling. "But I need you to know that I understand what I did was wrong. I let my biases cloud my judgment. I treated your son unfairly, and I'm deeply sorry." Chief Thompson listened, his face impassive. When Jack finished, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. "Jack, this isn't about forgiveness," Chief Thompson said, his voice low. "It's about change. It's about whether you can truly understand the damage you've done and whether you're willing to do the work to make amends." He paused, then continued, "I've seen the letters you've written. I've heard about your volunteer work. I've seen a change in you, but actions speak louder than words." Chief Thompson proposed a plan, a path to redemption. Jack would undergo intensive training in cultural sensitivity and implicit bias. He would mentor young people from the community, sharing his experiences and his newfound understanding. He would become an advocate for change within the police department. Jack accepted, eagerly grateful for the opportunity to make amends. He threw himself into the training sessions, absorbing every lesson, every insight. He spent countless hours with the young people, listening to their concerns, their fears, their hopes. He became a bridge between the police and the community, a voice for understanding and reconciliation. He spoke at community meetings, at schools, at churches, sharing his story, his journey, his commitment to justice. He also had to face Jamal. That meeting was harder. Jamal was understandably reserved. Jack spoke from the heart. He apologized. Jamal listened. Jamal said he would consider what Jack said. Jamal said that he respected that Jack was doing the work to change. Months passed and Jack's transformation was evident. He was a different man, a different officer. His colleagues noticed the change, his sincerity, his dedication. He became a leader, a mentor, a symbol of hope. Chief Thompson reinstated him not with fanfare but with quiet respect. Jack returned to the streets not as a predator but as a protector. He patrolled with a new awareness, a new understanding, a new commitment to justice. One evening Jack found himself at a community event, a celebration of diversity and unity. He saw Jamal standing near the back, a smile on his face. Jack approached him, hesitant but hopeful. "Jamal," Jack said, his voice soft, "it's good to see you." "Officer Stratton," Jamal replied, his smile widening. "It's good to see you too. I've been watching you. You've changed." "I have," Jack said, his eyes filled with sincerity, "and I'm grateful for the chance to make things right." They shook hands, a simple gesture but a powerful symbol of reconciliation. The crowd around them was diverse. Many were black, some were white, all were people. Jack looked around, and for the first time in a long time Jack felt hope. He knew there was still much work to be done, but he also knew that change was possible.